and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and geriatric care manager with Jewish Family and Children's Services Secure at Home program. JFCS offers a range of senior programming for the older adults in our community. Secure at Home is one of our senior service programs designed to help older adults age safely, comfortably, and independently in their own homes. Our geriatric care managers provide an umbrella of services to promote healthy aging and aging in place. Seniors find healing through support groups to work through age-related challenges. Tailored social and educational programs, as well as care management and senior nutrition programs, ensure that the needs of our older adults can be met. Thank you for joining us for today's book talk, Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited by Mimi Schwartz, a Princeton author who will share how one generation's memories taught her about being a neighbor in 1930s Germany and its relevance today. Mimi is an award-winning author of 7 books. Some of her other works are When History is Personal, Good Neighbors, Bad Times, Echoes of My Father's German Village, Thoughts from a Queen-Sized Bed, and Writing True, the Art and Craft of Creative Nonfiction. She has received several awards, including the Forward Bronze Book of the Year Award in Memoir, the Florida Review Editor's Prize, and the New Hampshire Outstanding Literary Nonfiction Award. And 10 have been notables in the Best American Essays series. She is Professor Emeriti in Writing at Richard Stockton University and lives here in Princeton, New Jersey. Before I turn the presentation over to Mimi, please know that questions and comments can be submitted in the Q&A or chat at any time and will be addressed at various points during the presentation. I will now give you Mimi Schwartz.
Well, thank you, Beth, for your introduction, and thank you for JFCS for all that you do for the young and for oldies like me, and for giving events like today, which give me the opportunity to talk about my newly released book, Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited. What I thought I'd do is to try to make it a little bit interactive and have a Q&A small part in the middle of the presentation and then have one at the end. So that should keep sort of lively, keep the talk a little livelier. And what I thought I'd do in the first part is to talk about what the book is about, why I wrote it, and using some slides to put you there. I think we were ready for the first slide, which is the image of the book, and which I think the University of Nebraska press designers did a wonderful job to capture what the story is between the two covers. So what you're looking at here is a street scene in a little village called Rexingen, which is about 60 kilometers southwest of Stuttgart in what's called the Schwarzwald, or Black Forest of Germany. And it is where my father was born in 1898, 35 years before Hitler came to power. And here's what the village looks like now. Pretty much the same size, but what is different, of course, there are no Jews there now, but when in my father's time, when he was a boy, what's unusual is that half of the village of 1,200 was Jewish. The other half was Catholic, with a few Protestant families. And the numbers went down in the 1920s as Jews from the villages all over Germany decided to go into the cities and find their fortune. My father was among them. He went to Frankfurt. But Rexingen, unlike most of the other little villages with Jews in it, there were 12 in all that were called the Judendorf, really held on to its Jews. And the reason was, I think, what my father would tell me in Queens, New York, where I was born and grew up, that in Rexingen, before Hitler, he'd say, we all got along. And he'd say that often. And I didn't listen too much because I was too busy trying to be an American girl like my friends and wanted his village and his German past in the past. But the echo of these words is what I heard 40 years later when I saw this village Torah. It was in a memorial room in Israel on a moshav called Shavei Tzion that was founded by a dozen or so Rexingen Jews fleeing Hitler in 1937-38, about the same time that my family fled to America. And the old man showing me around said that the Torah had been rescued on Kristallnacht, not by the village Jews, but by their Christian neighbors. And that caught my attention because I didn't think of Germans rescuing anything Jewish back then. Who did it and why, I wondered, and wanted to know more. And when I came back to New Jersey and told my friends about the rescue Torah, they too wanted to know more. Now, my father had died years before, so I couldn't ask him. So I sought out and interviewed Rexingen Jews, still alive and living in New York City. And in their stories, my father's words about getting along became an even louder echo, because though they hated Germany for betraying them, and this was the big surprise, they didn't hate their next door neighbors. Many were decent people, they remembered, trying to help as best they could. Now, my father's memories of We All Got Along was about life 30 years before Hitler. But these memories that I was hearing now were from the 1930s during the Nazi times. So did neighbors still try to get along? How much of it was true? And how much of it was nostalgia, people remembering what they wanted to be true? And so began my quest on 3 continents to find out about decency as remembered by the Jewish and Christian neighbors, villagers who were once good neighbors. So maybe go back to the book cover. Yeah. So the young girl on this Rexingen street is named Hannah, and she was an enormous help on this quest. She was the first one I met in New York City 60 years after the village photo, and she knew everyone. She put me in touch with everyone, the Jews who fled the village and the Christians who stayed, with whom, many of whom she had stayed in touch. I met over 40 people in all, and their stories became the basis for my 2008 book, Good Neighbors, Bad Times, Echoes of My Father's German Village. Now, the third figure on this cover is why Revisited is stamped on the original title. So let's get it. Here's a close-up. His name is Max Sire. He is 5 in this photo, but he's 88 when he wrote me from South Australia, where he lived since he was 21. He had left Germany as a young man because he thought there would be no future there, and he had an offer for a job in Australia. He met his wife there, stayed, raised a family. He had read 10 years after the book came out, my 2008 book, and wanted to tell me, and he actually used the same words, "Your father was right. We all got along before Hitler." And it turned out he had grown up in my father's village, 5 houses from where my father's family lived for generations. But the families never met because his Catholic family moved into an abandoned Jewish house in 1937, a few months after my uncle, the last of my family, to flee Germany, sold our family house. I answered Max's letter curious and found out that Max had written a memoir for his Australian family about growing up during the Third Reich, beginning in 1935 when he was 5, the age in the photo, and ending when he was 15 at the war's end. And it was in English. So he shares it with me. And as I'm reading, I hear our village stories talking to each other, as if out of 2 different windows of history. Here is a young Catholic boy's perspective. Everyone I'd met had been 6 to 20 years older in those days. Here is a family that did not self-identify as friends of the Jews, as did others I had interviewed. No one had mentioned this family. And remember, this was a tiny little village. And here is a private memoir written for family, not oral histories told to me, an American Jewish author, with her tape recorder running. So what to make of this family that no one mentioned as a good neighbor? For that is the group I had been focused on, good neighbors, people like me and you, I think, and how I hope I would behave to neighbors under threat in times of state-sponsored hate. So here are the sires in 1934, and Max is the boy in the upper right. How did they fit in or not into my existing story? That was my new quest. So now I'm happy to take a few questions about the village and whatever I might have left out that you want to know, my process of gathering the stories, my revisiting them 10 years later, whatever comes to mind. One thing I would like to say that I didn't mention yet is that between the first book and the second, I changed to the real name of the village, which is Rexingen. Those of you who read Good Neighbors, Bad Times, it was Benheim in the first book. And in that way, I was following a tradition. When you're writing about nonfiction about small villages, you use a pseudonym, but because it's a little village. And if you want to try to protect some anonymity, if you're writing about the postman's daughter and there's only one postman, you don't have privacy. So I did go to the real name because about 2 years after my book came out, the village had a website and they featured the book. So I figured the cat was out of the bag. And so I used the real name in this edition. Yeah.
So Mimi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I have a question that came up. How did you actually find Hannah? Like, you said that you were interviewing people in New York who had been from that village. What was the process that you went through to locate these people? Did you have a list of names from your parents, from notes from things, or did you just put it out there?
Well, that's a good story because it was, again, a kind of echo of my father's, because I came back to New Jersey, told my story of the rescue tower to my friends. And about a month and a half later, my mother hands me a folder that she found in the closet that had 3 typewritten pages, all sort of yellow, brittly paper with all the names of the Rexingen Jews, their addresses, often phone numbers, that my father had typed up, and had names of some of the Christian villagers that he was in touch with. So it was as if my father was saying from the grave, get going, find out about this.
Okay.
So that's how that happened. Yeah.
Okay. I see some comments here that Judy Hopford Deglin wrote that her father was born in the same town. So she's really very interested in this. And it's a very similar story. Do you know of the family of Kurt and Heinz Hopfer? Was that name a name that came?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the woman in my book, because I told you I use pseudonyms, what Hetty in my book is really her maiden name is Hopfer. So okay. She's in my book. So
she might want to reach out to you afterwards personally.
Absolutely.
Some more.
Yeah,
okay.
If you want to put my email down on mimischwartz2@gmail.com, okay. Please feel free to do so. We will chat.
And then we have some comments that someone wrote that they thought that the town is now half Muslim.
Not half, but a third of the town is Muslim. And it is, many of them moved into old Jewish houses. So the village is in some ways trying to reinvent itself. But of course, the Jews were there for over 400 years and the Muslims have just been there for maybe 20 years now. So they're not quite in the same place.
Okay. Another question is, were the Jews saved in the village?
No, they could not. It was a very tiny little town of 1,200. And as my father used to say, and the Christians said too, if someone was stirring a pot in their house, everybody knew what it was in all the other houses. So to actually hide someone in a village that size was very difficult. Whereas, as we know, in Berlin, in a big city where there's more anonymity, you could in fact hide people more easily.
Did your father ever go back to visit his village?
Oh, yes. My father, as a matter of fact, my father took me back when I was 13. He wanted to see me to see where the place where he was born. I have a whole chapter about that in my book. And yes, he went back, and one of the women I interviewed, the former mayor's wife, she thought my father walked on water because he had arranged for her daughter who went to Israel to stay in a place. So he was, yes, so he did have some contact with the villagers after as well. Yeah. Some of the villagers who were, as I talked about, who self-identified as friends of the Jews, not only talking about the past, but who stayed in touch afterwards.
We have Dennis asked, to what extent were Nazis and or Nazi sympathizers in Rexingen and the surrounding communities in the mid-late 1930s and early 40s? And if so, how public were they with their activities?
Well, my activity was much later.
No, but I think he was asking about during the time in the 30s, were the Nazis present in that town, and did people know what they were doing or trying to do?
Right. So there were Nazis in the town, but not as many as in other places. For example, Horp, which is a bigger town, maybe 2 kilometers away, there was a pretty active Nazi party. And different towns had different strengths. A town called Nordstadt had a big active party. But in Rexingen, there were Nazis, but there were also quite a lot of people who either were neutral. It was, here's, and I write about this in the book, because a lot of the other half of the village was Catholic. In this particular region, the Catholics were in the minority, so their allegiance was more towards Catholicism, like the Catholic youth group was what people wanted to join, not the Hitler youth group. So that was also sort of tamped down enthusiasm for the Nazis. Not of everybody, but it was not, in this particular village, it was not a strong Nazi party.
Okay. We have a few more questions and I want to get back to your presentation. Right. So let me just ask one more. There was some questions about when did the Jews first arrive in that town and how they got there. And there was a comment that the village was founded in the 1300s by knights on their way to a crusade. Is that your understanding as well?
They were, the lands were owned by the Knights of St. John's, the Johannite Knights, and they invited Jews to come to the village, come to their lands, I should say, in the mid-17th century. So that's why I mentioned before there were these 12 Judendorfs. That was all the Knights of Johannite land. And so I think a few Jews came in the 17th century. My family goes back there until, I think there's a grave from great-great-great-grandfather 1760, 41, something like that.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. One is, and this we might want to put off to the end because it might be a very involved story, but do you want to share the story of Heinz and Barbara? Was asked.
Let's move that.
Okay. I had a feeling that might be something, but I don't want to ignore it. And the other one is, do you know how many Jews from the village survived the war? Do you have any information about
that? 2 people survived the war, and I have a chapter. I interviewed one of them whose name in the book is Willie. He was a butcher in Baltimore, and he has quite an amazing story. So I urge people to check him out.
Okay, so let's go back to your program.
Okay, great.
But everyone can continue submitting questions and comments for the next break.
Right. So what I'd like to do now is to read two excerpts that illustrate why I heard a conversation between the stories in Max's memoir and the stories in mine. So both excerpts are about how the sense of trust in the village where everyone got along began to break down and to collapse after Kristallnacht in November 1938. The first is from Lottie, that's again a pseudonym, and one of the first Jews who I wrote about in my 2008 book. And the second is from Max, and it comes from his memoir written 20 years ago and sent to me 2 years ago. So here's Lottie. Here she is in the village at around age 13, holding on to her two little cousins, and they called her Stumpala at the time. And here she is when I met her in Riverdale, New York, holding her granddaughter. As you can see, she is no longer a Stumpala. And in this excerpt, she is recalling both the pleasures and the terrors that she remembers in her Rexingen childhood. And as you'll hear, those two memories are fighting each other for a position in how she remembers this village. So I'll read that. Lottie talks of how she used to climb up to the meadow on that hill to pick flowers, lie in the sun, and to listen to the sounds of the village. It was so wonderful. I'd hear the voices of the village and the sound of the anvil, and the smithy made such a wonderful sound that it would echo in my ears. The crowing, the mooing of the cows, and the sense of belonging, that this was my place. And then Lottie talks about the Nazi festivities that were held under the swastika mounted on that same hill. They would congregate under it at night and make a huge fire. You'd hear crowds yelling, torches swaying. It was very frightening to us. And they'd sing Nazi songs and shout anti-Semitic propaganda. Did you know the people who went to the bonfires, I asked? Were they out-of-towners or were they from Rexingen? Some were from Rexingen. There was one, the son of the letter carrier, and the father wanted nothing to do with him. Another family nearby was also Nazi. But most of our neighbors were very supportive of the Jews. Everyone said it couldn't last forever. The Allies wouldn't permit it. And the Nazi government will fall and everything will be like before. She smiles. You can't minimize the illusions that people live under. The illusions were nurtured, she says, not only by our optimistic neighbors, but also by fear of starting somewhere else, of not having enough money to leave, of having an old parent who wouldn't be able to get a visa. The illusions lasted until after Kristallnacht, she said. Only then did neighbors no longer dare to say hello to the public. And children began to throw stones more openly, even though their parents, they disapproved. And the constant barrage of anti-Semitic propaganda had its effect. When you're pounded with how terrible the Jews are, even I, after a while, began to feel like a bad person. Even in 1939, right before Lottie left on the last boat to leave Germany before the war, her memories of bad are overshadowed by good. And the image of Nazi bonfires does not undermine her belief in communal decency prevailing over random violence. The Rexingeners, you know, were not animals, she insists. That would not go in our village. They didn't beat up anybody or harm anybody. Even if they were arrested someone, they were civil. You couldn't just beat up anybody because you felt like beating up. There was a code still maintained, a code of civility. Was that true in other villages? I asked. Lottie said she didn't know for sure. Many did not have so many Jews, she said. You know, they were half of our village once. So that code of civility, which Lottie said stopped daily brutality, did not stop 87 Jews less lucky than Lottie and my family from being deported and murdered in the Nazi death camps. So no Jews live in the village now. Well, actually, one Jew does. He's the beekeeper, and he came from Russia via Israel, and he does live there. I did meet him the last time I was there. So now let me introduce Max. Here he is at age 8, which is how old he was in the Kristallnacht memory that I'm going to read. He's maybe 5 years younger than Lottie. And here he is with his wife, Bernie, when we met on Skype a year after he sent me that very first letter. So this is Max's words here from his memoir. Kristallnacht brought about a very different way of life, most Christians being ashamed of what happened. The Jews not trusting us anymore. They stayed in their houses most of the time, and they were made to wear the Star of David on their clothes when they appeared in public. Their businesses had to display signs stating that inside is a Jewish-owned business. Nazis glued placards on those houses urging Germans don't buy at Jewish businesses, which of course the Jewish owners weren't brave enough to remove. I was always told to treat Jews the same as everybody else, but that estranged feeling stayed with me. I used to feel uneasy when I met Jews on the road. Some of our Jewish neighbors also showed an annoyance at us. There weren't many friendly smiles anymore. I suppose they didn't know they did wrong to be treated like this. They had lived their lives as they were brought up, and that they never heard any Christians or Jews, any Christians in Rexingen. Every now and then, 1 or 2 Jewish families disappeared. They would go across the Swiss border and then go to Portugal, and from there to America or England. 2 or 3 months after they left Germany, somebody heard that they were in London or in America. Further down the street, there lived a couple of girls my age, and this was their plight. When I heard about it, I felt sorry for them, as I knew they couldn't speak English. And I said to my mom, but they can't talk to anybody. And Mom said, they can't speak to anybody here either. So what I love about these memories is the way that they let you into the world as one person experiences it. And if it is a world that you think you already know, as I did, and you discover that you don't really know it completely, so much the better, I would say. And that, I feel, is the power of memoir, to turn a one-dimensional stereotype of the Jewish neighbor or the German neighbor into 3-dimensional people. And that power, and I just realized this recently, is probably why Max and his family wrote me in the first place. The Rexingen Jews were not spoken about in the stories that he told about the past. That's what Max's children told me. And when they were visiting Rexingen as young children, which they did, coming from Australia for several summer vacations to visit their grandparents, they'd walk past the former synagogue, the old Jewish cemetery in the woods, and all was silent. There were no stories. But when they read passages like Lottie's, they entered into her world, and that filled a void for the sires. And reading Max's memoir filled a void for me as well, because I had focused on good neighbors only and needed to look beyond that for the stories still in shadow if I was going to really understand this village. So before taking on some more Q&As, I did want to show you two more slides that of interest. So this first is a year after that first letter, when we've been corresponding regularly back and forth. I asked lots of questions about the memoir. Max answered. His son in the lower left, Maxla, I called him, answered. Bernard is the other son. His daughter, Max's daughter, Trudy Ann, is behind, and there's me. And we finally meet as virtual neighbors, and had a conversation as if we were living next door, sort of trying to fill in all the gaps in this village history that we share. And if you want to hear what we talked about and meet the Sayers yourself, if you go to my website and go under video, you can see a 6-minute sort of condensation of our conversation. So that would be mimischwartz.net if you want to see that. And then the last slide that I wanted to show you, which I hope will spark some conversation. One second, please. Is a list, not a complete list. There are more in my book itself, but of the kind of small acts of kindness and decency that you won't find in the history books. Certainly not anything to brag about, not a Schindler rescue, not anyone saving life, but small acts that mattered. People didn't brag about it because there wasn't much. And also during Nazi times, it would have been dangerous to do so. Some people did get in trouble. After, you wouldn't talk about it because people who didn't help would not appreciate it, especially in a small town. And also because they're small in comparison to the atrocities of the Holocaust. You don't go around saying, well, I gave a rescue. I shared my ration card with someone. And yet I think these things matter. We need to know about them, because I think that we have to ask when we look at this list, and maybe I'll read it. Well, the first one is the policeman saved the Torah. He actually saved 2. I found another one in Burlington, Vermont. The shoemaker kept fixing Jewish shoes and shared his ration cards. The farmer had the power of attorney over, who had a power of attorney over Jewish fields, and he gave them back after the war. The barber's daughter lent her good raincoat. The shopkeeper gave food over the back fence at night. And the neighbor took care of Jewish children, half Jewish children, when the mother was sick. So those are the kind of things. And you say, well, they're small, but what I kept asking myself, and I hope everybody does, is how many of those things would I have been brave enough to do? And how many would I do now for neighbors under threat? So the only other thing I want to say before is, I should close by saying one other force that made me revisit the village that is important is that during the same week that Max's letter arrived was the same week that 11 Jews were massacred in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, 350 miles away from my house. And it was a feeling of the past moving in closer that, coupled with Max's letter, made me revisit the village history to find out more about what it means to be a neighbor and what it means to be a good neighbor in polarized times, as we had in 1930s Germany and as we have today. So I'll stop there and see what other questions you have.
We have a couple of comments. One is that I believe you or someone else once told, I'm not sure who sent this in, okay, told this person submitted this, that on Kristallnacht, the non-Jewish villagers refused to take part in the burning and were punished for it, and that thugs were actually brought in from the outside to do that.
There was a consensus, both the Jews who fled and the Christians who were still in the village, to say that it was not the Rexingeners who burned the synagogue, but that the Nazis, as not even uniquely to Rexingen, but to a lot of these villages, brought in people from another town who had no connection with the people there to destroy the synagogues, because, and I think this is key, is that if you know your neighbors and you share history and you have good relations, now you can also have very bad relations with neighbors, so that breaks down. But as I think Lottie was talking about, this code of civility, of being a good neighbor, if that exists, people don't so easily turn against that. And so bringing in people from the outside to burn the synagogue would be essential, because people in the town are not going to do it.
What do you think was culturally different about that village that made them less likely to turn away from the Jews?
It's a really interesting question that I certainly asked all along. I'm a teacher for many, many, many years. And I started to liken it to going into a classroom the first day, that you walk in a classroom, there are 30 people there, and you either feel this click where people have a shared sense of cooperation, or there's a tension where you know you're going to have a harder semester. And I think that commitment to cooperation was part of the DNA of this village. And interestingly enough, I once went around with a reporter who covered all of the town meetings for all the villages. And 5 kilometers or miles away from Rexingen was another village that had Jews, but they had a history for 200 years of warring families. And she said, you can still go to the town meetings, and the character of the town, whether they are trying to make a connection to get along or whether they have a tradition of battling each other, is still there. And I once, I taught the book, and I asked my students to write about to what extent was their town or their village or their neighborhood similar or not to Rexingen. And I got 2 very different responses. We were all very interested in, people would write, oh, my town or my apartment house or my unit, whatever it is just like Rexingen. And other people would write and say, in my neighborhood, somebody could drop dead on the street and people would just walk over them. So that sense of whether you're making a commitment to cooperation and sharing and a code of civility is there or it's not there. And in Rexingen, it was there. But unfortunately, there are many more places where it's not so much there.
Another question came up. How were the Jews removed from the village? And did any of the villagers help the Jews to flee, those who were trying to escape after 1939?
Not after. So there was the story, and it's alluded to in one of the excerpts I read, that the town taxi driver, equivalent to a taxi driver, did drive a family to the Swiss border. And that person got in trouble, was taken away for a week or a period of time. Family didn't know if he would come back, and he did. But so that was the level, that was probably the biggest act of helping the Jews in which there were consequences. But no, most of them were small acts. And again, what points to a kind of getting along is that there were avid Nazis in the town. It's not, I can't say that there may be 10 or 12 families that really helped the Jews. This is a quote in my book too, of 3 little girls who grew up there who were half Jewish. And the older one said, there were 10 or 12 families without whom we couldn't survive. There were another or there were another 10% that were avid Nazis, and the rest were going on with their lives, trying to get along to go along, which is, I think, where the sires were. They were not anti-Semitic, but they weren't battling Hitler either. So I hope that answered the question.
How do you apply the good neighbor, bad times lessons to today, especially when the idea of neighborhood or community has broadened through technology and social media? Are our neighbors defined more broadly now, and should they be?
I think yes. I mean, as I said, I feel that the sires and I became virtual neighbors, but I think that that we need to make a commitment to trying to get along. And when I think back now, when my father was telling me that, he was telling me about what was good about his boyhood, but also about the fragility, how that can go away. So when he was a boy in 1898, everybody got along. When Hitler came to power, suddenly that was breaking down. And I think all of us in these last 10 years since I wrote 2008 book can see how that fragility goes. I mean, we are having so much trouble interacting with who we perceive as other. And I felt as if this year in which I interacted with Max and his family, in which we had a goal. We didn't dwell on what was bad in the past. We had a goal to try to fill in the gaps together of this village history, share what we remembered. And that was enough to move forward, where I think we became we trusted each other. We built up a level of cooperation that did not involve forgetting the past or forgiving the past on my part, but involved moving forward. And I think we have to find that today if we are going to survive. We have to figure out, how do you deal with other? How can you not say that you agree with what you don't agree, but to find ways of moving forward. And that has to be the conversation that we have to have and find a way to develop. And what's come up before, and as a example of that is in today's, what do you do if you have your Black Lives Matter sign on your lawn, and next door your neighbor puts out a Trump sign? Does that mean you're not going to talk about anything? Are you going to not put politics aside and find how you are going to deal with each other on a daily basis? If your Trump neighbor's son falls off a bike in front of your house, do you go out and pick them up and put Band-Aids on? And is that enough to keep you moving in a positive rather than just a negative direction?
Certainly gives you things to think about in terms of day-to-day lives and the things that we're seeing on TV and how things play out with all the political and social things happening right now. Last comment that we have here is from Kent H. And he wrote, the town archivist who helped put together the cemetery book was Adolf Sayer. He claimed to be in the Luftwaffe, but only as an aerial photographer. Is he related to the Australian family?
Well, yes, yes, he is Adolf Sayer, who in my book is Herr Stoller, was a central to me in my work in the village. He was like the Hana of the village. He knew everybody. He took me around, introduced me to everybody. In Rexingen, which is 1,200 people, everybody is pretty much related in some way to other people. So the sires in Australia, I think, are second or second or third cousins to, so they knew him a little, you know, as you would if you're living in a town, but they were not closely related.
We do have a comment that we'll just mention now that, to connect with Mimi about her book, it's Mimi Schwartz, #2 @gmail.com. And we've also posted on the chat thing a link to her YouTube, her interview with the other family. Mimi's books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and also Labyrinth bookstores and other stores nearby in both print and Kindle editions. And we also have our presentation recorded, and it will be available on the JFCS YouTube page, which is youtube.com/JFCS Mercer starting tomorrow. So feel free to share it. And it will be available. It will also be shared within a week on our social media channels, Facebook and Instagram.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that because somebody asked me that, and good to know. You'll send me the link?
I will send you the link, and then you can also post it on your website as well. But it will be available through our link, which is www.jfcsonline.org.
Okay, great.
So thank you all for attending. As I said, the book is available, and we'll have this video available as well. We are proud to continue offering our full services in line with health and safety guidelines during this challenging time. Learn more about all our programs, including webinars and resources, at www.jfcsonline.org. Mimi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was very interesting, and I hope that the others who participated equally, feel the same way.
Great. Well, I enjoyed, and thank you all for your questions and your comments. Wonderful.
Yeah, we had a lot of responders, so it was great. Thank you all.